think now we have close to 40 foreign countries that have legal medical marijuana. The United States is actually technically not one of them because marijuana remains in Schedule 1 to this very day under federal law. But the federal law is not being enforced in California and other medical marijuana states out of, I think, the prosecutorial discretion.
Welcome to High Five with Dr. Igor Grant, Distinguished Professor of Psychiatry and Director of the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research at UC San Diego. Each episode will take you on a fascinating journey into the evolving world of medicinal cannabis, as Dr. Grant poses 5 thought-provoking questions to his guest, uncovering their personal journey and unique contributions to the field. Now, here's your host, Dr. Igor Grant.
Today, I am pleased to welcome as my guest Dr. Dale Geringer, who has been the state coordinator of California NORML, which is the national organization for the reform of marijuana laws, since 1987. He's also vice chairman of the National NORML Board of Directors and director of the California Drug Policy Forum. Dr. Gieringer has published research on medical cannabis usage, cannabis smoke harm reduction, potency testing, cannabis and driving safety, and drug urinalysis. He has testified before the legislature and in the court on issues concerning personal use of cannabis. Dale, welcome to the podcast. Okay, well, let me ask you this. You got your PhD from Stanford University. As I understand it, your PhD work concerned consumer choice and FDA drug regulation. Can you tell us a little bit more about your background and how you became interested in the question of cannabis legalization?
Right. Well, my PhD dissertation was indeed on FDA drug regulation. It actually had nothing to do with psychoactive drugs. It had to do with non-psychoactive pharmaceutical drugs for the most part, but it was partly inspired by the fact that the provost and later president of Stanford University at the time had been administrator of the FDA, and the FDA had actually been criticized for a long time for overregulation of consumer choice in general and making decisions for itself that really should have been perhaps better made by individuals. And my dissertation was about how to improve basically the information that consumers get and doctors get so they could make better choices about the use of pharmaceutical drugs. And I'm happy to say that a lot of my recommendations have since been adopted in the years since I wrote that thesis. At the same time, like a lot of people in my generation, I was interested in marijuana for personal use. And even though it was not part of my PhD dissertation exactly, the whole subject of government regulation of drugs had always been in my mind, always been sort of very anti-prohibitionist type of person. And it so happened that around 1986 or so, I attended a conference of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, which I had previously had no association with at all. NORML was founded in 1971, but in 1986, they had a conference in Portland, Oregon that I decided to attend because I was actually working on an article at that particular time about DEA drug regulation. It was sort of an outgrowth of my FDA interests in my PhD dissertation. Thought it would be a useful forum. I was really impressed by the speakers that I heard at the NORML conference in Portland, and I learned that California NORML was looking for a new director. And since I had background in this area, I decided to volunteer myself. And so I did. And I figured at the time, 1986, for those of you who don't remember, was really sort of the height, the peak of the anti-drug hysteria, frankly, that hit the nation, and actually due to the crack cocaine epidemic. And at that time, you could not say anything favorable about any illegal drugs. It was totally taboo, and you were really risking your career and your freedom and everything else if you confessed to having anything to do with any illegal drug. And I figured this was a good time to get involved because, frankly, the legalization movement had at that point sort of withered away, and I thought better to get involved while things are at the bottom. It's an opportunity. They can't get worse from here. They can only get better. As it turned out, things did get worse for a couple more years, but we turned it around. And with our the medical marijuana movement in 1991 in San Francisco, and things have been on a different course ever since. So I'm glad I got involved when I did.
Yeah, very interesting. So we'll get back to that process in a moment. You had talked a little bit about NORML and particularly CalNORML. Can you say just a little bit more about that organization? What does it do? What is its mission?
Well, NORML was formed in Washington, D.C. by Keith Stroup, who was a Nader's Raider public interest lawyer, and he thought that there needed to be a consumer advocacy group for marijuana users. And he rounded up some support from Nader and from couple other donors, put together the organization. And it's very interesting to note one of the first projects that NORML got involved in was the rescheduling of marijuana, which right after NORML got founded in 1972, there was the great Presidential Commission on Marijuana that Nixon appointed, the Schaefer Commission, which, much to Nixon's surprise and dismay, sort of recommended that, well, this marijuana stuff is not as dangerous as it seems, and it should be at least decriminalized for personal use. And at the same time, Congress had recently passed the Controlled Substances Act, in which they set up a bunch of schedules for various kinds of drugs, and marijuana had been put in the highest, most dangerous Schedule 1, where it still is today. And Schedule 1 meant no accepted medical use and extreme danger of abuse. So in 1972, I think it was, we filed suit, or NORML filed suit in federal court to reschedule marijuana. Actually, we were asked to put it in Schedule 2. And that lawsuit went on for 19 years before finally being totally defeated in Federal Court of Appeals, after the administrative judge, actually Francis Young, had ruled that, well, yes, after listening to testimony, found that, yeah, marijuana, in fact, did have a lot of medical uses, and it was really pretty safe. It's safe as aspirin, is what he said, and should be rescheduled, but the DEA overruled it, and we still stand there today. That all happened before I got involved in NORML. Now, California NORML, which I'm involved with, actually started originally in, again, around, there was a predecessor organization called Amorphia, which in 1971 decided to organize the first and statewide initiative to legalize marijuana for personal use. Free backyard marijuana was the basic idea. And basically a bunch of hippies got together and raised a lot of money selling rolling papers. That's what Amorphia did. They sold hemp rolling papers, and that financed the petition campaign and put the 1972 California Marijuana Initiative on the ballot. I believe it's the first vote anywhere in the world, a popular vote on cannabis legalization. Everybody expected it to be soundly trounced. The press was unanimously against it. It got 33% of the vote, which actually surprised people. It was surprisingly strong. And as a result of that, and of the fact that California was being overridden with felony marijuana possession cases, because basically possession of any amount of marijuana was a mandatory felony then. And 1974, you had 100,000 of these cases every year. And the legislature saw that this was just too much. And CalNORML was the chief lobbyist and sponsor of the Moscone Act, which decriminalized marijuana and made possession of an ounce or less punishable by a minor fine. That law was actually approved. This is the 50th anniversary in July. It's the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Moscone Act, which was CalNORML's first legislative accomplishment. And we've been around ever since.
Good. Well, thanks. That provides us with a background. Now, you were involved in the passage of California Proposition 215, which allowed California to become the first state in the nation to permit medicinal cannabis. And you were then involved in the passage of Proposition 64, which legalized cannabis in California subject to certain restrictions. Tell us how these initiatives came about and how the public was persuaded to endorse them.
Okay,
You began by saying there was a lot of
my position was different in these two initiatives. In Prop 215, the medical marijuana initiative, I was one of the organizing sponsors. Prop 64, actually, we supported, but we had other ideas than Prop 64 about what to do about legalization. I'll get into that. But what happened with the medical marijuana initiative was it was really the work of this gay activist and marijuana dealer, Dennis Peron, in San Francisco, who had a really large and popular following. And uh, around these or so, the HIV epidemic had really hit San Francisco very hard. There were a lot of gay people in San Francisco, and a lot of them were finding that marijuana was useful for medical purposes. So there was a lot of incipient support in the gay community, which was very well organized in San Francisco, for doing something about medical access to marijuana. Plus, there were all these reports about marijuana possibly being useful for cancer, of nausea due to cancer chemotherapy, and glaucoma was another thing that had come up. And there had been repeated attempts to get the federal government to loosen their restrictions on medical marijuana and allow more patients access. And these attempts were really closed by the Bush first administration around 1990. They just said, no, we're not going to allow any medical access, even on an investigational basis. And so there were no legal alternatives. And around this time, I was manning the California NORML hotline. You get calls from the public with problems with marijuana or marijuana laws. And I was getting a lot of calls from people who were using marijuana for medical purposes, for purposes not for actually for AIDS or for cancer or for glaucoma, but often for rare and unusual diseases and a lot of chronic pain situations, a lot of muscular skeletal problems, accidents, rare diseases that I had never heard of, like Peutz-Jeghers syndrome, trigeminal neuralgia, all of these um, strange conditions. At the meantime, I had also met a remarkable figure who pioneered in medical marijuana, needs to be mentioned, Dr. Todd Mikuriya, who was located actually a neighbor of mine here in Berkeley. Uh, Todd Mikuriya had been involved actually in NIH's early in the 60s, their marijuana program and their marijuana research, in fact. And while he was there, he did a literature review of the use of cannabis for medical purposes, going back to the earliest sources in the Western medical literature from the 19th century, beginning with William O'Shaughnessy in, I guess, 1839, first reported on the medical use of marijuana in India. Well, then there's a bunch of other reports that especially from the 19th century, but going up into the 20th century, doctors who found marijuana or cannabis useful for medical purposes. And Dr. Mikuriya was himself a licensed psychiatrist and began monitoring patients who found that they had conditions which were treatable with cannabis themselves. A lot of them were patients with various kinds of intractable chronic pain, sometimes with a component that was psychiatric as well as clearly physical, including patients with anxiety and other psychiatric problems. And he was monitoring them and following and finding that there were just lots of uses for it. In fact, one of his early discoveries was that cannabis seemed to be especially effective as an immunomodulator, as he called it, modulating the immune system, preventing autoimmune illnesses such as an autoimmune disease might be, for example, multiple sclerosis. Cannabis is used a lot in multiple sclerosis. MS is an autoimmune disease, as are forms of migraine, for example, which he also found a lot of migraine patients using cannabis. And he kept a log of all of these patients. And in the end, by the time he died in 2009, he had over 9,000 patients that he had tracked. He'd taken ICD-9 indications and found literally, I think, over 200 different ICD-9 indications for which he had patients who were reporting medical value from cannabis. After talking to him and meeting some of his patients, I was appreciating that there was a lot of medical potential out there. And the fact that the Bush administration had shut down all medical access and research as well into medical cannabis, we thought it was time to do a counteroffensive. And it was Dennis Peron's idea in 1991 to do a San Francisco medical marijuana initiative. And the idea was just to put the city of San Francisco on the record as favoring the medical use of marijuana. It didn't really have any force of law because San Francisco couldn't change its state laws. But as it turned out, it was by far the most popular measure on the ballot that day in November 1990. Got 80% of the vote. And when we saw that spectacular result, we knew we had an important issue that we could carry elsewhere. And so we did, actually. We had friends down in Santa Cruz, and they did their own initiative the next year. And then we went around to city councils. And there were, at the time, there were a lot of patients were starting to get the story about that marijuana could help them. And they were like growing marijuana themselves in their yard, and they were getting arrested for felony because it was a felony to grow any marijuana. And so we had legal cases around all of this. And we would take them around to city councils from San Francisco to San Diego, in fact, and getting resolutions from the cities sort of supporting medical marijuana as well. So this worked its way up the ladder, and we started to work on state legislation to actually affect something. And that became Proposition 250, put on the ballot, and was on the ballot in 1996. We had by this time, Dennis Peron, following up on San Francisco's approval of medical marijuana, had established this buyers club. It's called the San Francisco Patients Buyers Club, where he was pretty much openly selling marijuana to anybody who could come in with a doctor's note saying they needed it. So he had like thousands of customers there for this place that he was operating publicly and with the permission of the city government, basically, in the Castro district in San Francisco. And this generated even more publicity. And we got press coming in from around the world, literally, coming to the Buyers Club and observing these, talking to these patients, some of them in wheelchairs, some little old ladies, all sorts of people who were testifying on camera to the medical advantages of marijuana. And we were getting great publicity out of all of this. So we were pretty confident that we would, in fact, be able to win an initiative if we got it on the ballot. Getting the funding was quite a challenge, as it turned out, but fortunately, our friend Ethan Nadelman rounded up funding from George Soros and George Zimmer and some other millionaires to finance the Proposition 215 campaign. We got on the ballot, and it passed by 56% of the vote, as we had expected it to do. And one of the key provisions in Prop 215 that we were very insistent on was to allow the personal use cultivation of marijuana for medical use by the patient or by the patient's caregiver. So to provide a legal supply of marijuana, which had not been available in the United States, for a couple generations since the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 and before. And that really opened the door to the modern medical marijuana movement. And then the initiatives got carried on to other states and so forth. And I think now we have close to 40 foreign countries that have legal medical marijuana. The United States is actually technically not one of them because marijuana remains in Schedule 1 to this very day under federal law. But the federal law is not being enforced in California and other medical marijuana states out of, I think, the prosecutorial discretion.
So that's very interesting. So the process was really, pardon the pun, kind of began as a grassroots effort.
Yes.
Going to the communities and so forth and kind of building this support that then allowed the proposition to pass. For those listeners, in California, the citizens have a right to put a law on the ballot, and then it can become a law even if the legislature hasn't done it, because this wasn't something the legislature did. It was really a public initiative, right?
One interesting thing I should mention too about that campaign, because we did polling, obviously, and one of the poll questions we asked was, do you this was a telephone poll of voters. Do you know somebody who uses marijuana for medicine? And we got 30% response positive. So we had already 1/3 of the population personally knew that marijuana did have medical purposes, which was a really strong support to have, contradicting the government's claims, which they kept insisting on, that no, marijuana can't be used for medicine, it should remain strictly illegal. There was a lot, the public knew a lot more about medical marijuana than the high muckety mucks in the government.
Yeah, well, I guess it's kind of an example where, maybe government also could take a lesson from this, that if you really deny the facts long enough, and by the way, I'm not saying or endorsing that marijuana is good for everything or that it's the panacea, but if you take the opposite position that it's pure poison all the time, and that's patently not true, people will get ahead of you and figure out what's right. And this is kind of an example of that. Yeah.
But it amazes me that now, over 30 years basically since we passed Prop 215, the federal government has not yet recognized.
Right. Well, it
Fighting.
looked like for a little time in the kind of waning years of the Biden administration, there might have been an effort to reschedule, right, to Schedule 3, but that, I guess, has.
Well, theoretically, the DEA is supposed to hold hearings about this scheduling recommendation that came out in the Biden administration, but the DEA has a long record of just indefinitely delaying anything it doesn't want to deal with or approve. There's no deadlines for DEA to do anything at all, and no penalties for them not doing anything. And so that's been the ongoing problem there. And I don't expect them to do anything positive under this administration.
I think it's at least half of the population or more lives in states where marijuana is now legal recreationally, I think.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So, and most states have some sort of medical marijuana regime.
Most, yes, that's
That's right,
true.
isn't it?
Now, the recreational marijuana, which was Prop 64 in 2016, was a different matter, because originally I had gotten involved in NORML with the idea of getting some sort of legal general adult access to cannabis, like we have to alcohol and tobacco in the United States. And so after we passed Prop 215 And it had started to spread around. And people started feeling, I think, a little bit more comfortable with open sales and use of marijuana, at least for medicine, because you had these uh, different dispensaries or patients groups opening up around the state where they were serving, thousands, actually hundreds of thousands of patients by the 2000s. And, the sky was not falling in. And there was a general sense that maybe the public would become more accepting of marijuana adult use in general. So, but we had always held back, or I had held back from pushing too hard on that button because the polls for general legalization were very unfavorable. You found at most like 40% of the public would support legalization, and there would be more like 45% would be strongly opposed. And that was just an impossible kind of public opinion barrier to overcome for many years, up through 2008. That was the case. Then all of a sudden, when Obama got elected, right after the election in 2008, there was a sudden change in the whole the atmosphere in general had felt like something had freed up somehow or other. And there happened to be a poll taken in right after the election about marijuana legalization. And it was the first poll that we ever saw, which reported that in fact there was a small majority in favor of adult use legalization in the West Coast states. It was like 51%. Other regions of the country didn't show that, but it showed up in the West Coast states. And so we saw that, aha, now is the time we can seriously start considering adult use legalization. There were lots of us at that point had been involved in the medical marijuana thing. Various groups started, debating, what might be done to have a general legalization initiative. And one group was directed by a gentleman named Richard Lee, who had established a very high profile medical cannabis and cannabis center in Oakland called Oaksterdam. His goal was to make Oakland like Amsterdam. And while everything was still, only medical marijuana was legal, Richard Lee wanted to push ahead to adult use legalization. And he had a fair amount of money that he had made uh, uh, in the Oaksterdam business, and he decided that he would launch an initiative uh, to which was called Prop 19 in 2010 to legalize marijuana. Now, I had problems with Richard's initiative because I thought 2010 was premature. I thought, we had maybe 51 or 55% in the polls, but we really needed 60% to win something. And I didn't particularly care for the way Richard had gone ahead, sort of with his own little group of attorneys, and I thought put together an initiative that wasn't likely to be very viable because it was based totally on local option in such a way that could be like totally legal here in, say, Oakland, where I am, to have like a ton of marijuana by local option. And then if you just went across the city line to Orinda, it could still be a felony to grow a single plant. And that seemed like a very chaotic kind of system to try to uh, uh, legislate, and it got criticized, but it's still, the Prop 19 did come in with, I think, 46% of the vote in 2010. But after that, Colorado and Washington State in 2012 went on to have successful legalization initiatives. And so uh, there was a lot of momentum in California to do an initiative in actually we were aiming for 2016. A number of groups formed to discuss plans for a 2016 initiative. And I got together with some people at Oaksterdam and other organizations. We tried to get a collection of organizations, including NORML and MPP, but also the ACLU, the Drug Policy Alliance, some veterans groups, and so forth, to uh, together have a legalization initiative for 2016. But in the meantime, there were some groups that were sort of falling off and planning their own thing. And one of them was very, very well funded by, there was a gentleman named Sean Parker, who I guess made $1 billion on PayPal or something like that, and announced he was very interested in running his own initiative. And he had like $10 million or something that he was willing to put into it. Well, when word about this spread around, it became very difficult for us and our coalition to actually collect money on our own. We needed $1 million or $2 to get on the ballot. And the notion that there was this other guy sitting with 10 million out there sort of made it difficult for us to raise money. Now, we tried to talk to the Sean Parker people, but they were very hush hush and wouldn't deal with us at all, at least not until the very end. So as it turned out, the coalition I was talking about, which was called California Coalition for Cannabis Policy Reform, wrote our own initiative, and Sean Parker and his team of professional lobbyists, actually from Sacramento, started working on their own initiative, which was what became Prop 64. And in the end, we both submitted ballot language, but because Sean Parker had the bucks and we didn't, Sean Parker was the one that ended up on the ballot. But we had a lot of problems with Prop 64. We thought it was really overwritten, over restrictive in many respects, and was not very respectful of medical cannabis. It sort of subsumed medical cannabis in this general adult use framework that was, highly regulated, with regulations about everything that had to do with certainly with the industry, about, you had to have, if you were going to grow it, you had to have permits from, environmental impact reviews, you had to have local government had to approve it, the state government had to approve it, you had to have a certain amount of acreage, and you had to have certain kind of security fences, and you had to have certain kind of waste disposal systems and certain kind of transporters, and it was very, very detailed and prescriptive, and we thought rather expensive to comply with. So we were not, our coalition favored a looser, more loosely written initiative, and one that would give more recognition to the rights of medical access. We didn't think that it was right for any locality to be able to forbid medical marijuana in California. We were willing to concede local decision on adult use access, but not on the medical. But that didn't get into Prop 64. So you still have, even today, there are places that are resisting allowing deliveries of medical cannabis within their county. Even though, in fact, since Prop 64 was passed, we had to have a special bill trying to authorize delivery of medical cannabis, but that legislation has had problems of its own and is not being totally honored everywhere. So there's been continued fallout. So anyhow, we had our doubt, we had our reservations about Prop 64, but we supported it for one big reason, namely that it decriminalized, defelonized marijuana. And there were, at the time, even though Prop 215 greatly facilitated access to marijuana, it had relatively little impact on the total number of marijuana felony arrests in California. We still had like 15,000 felonies a year coming in, despite having, done this medical initiative. And we wanted to get the penalties for basically any amount of cultivation was considered a felony if it wasn't medical, and any amount of possession for sale or distribution was considered a felony. So people, like who were caught on like hanging out on Telegraph Avenue with 2 or 3 joints in their pocket could be booked on felony for intent to distribute because they had extra joints in their pocket. Could be considered peddlers or something like that. That ended with Prop 64. Prop 64 sort of reduced all of these petty things to misdemeanors or infractions and has really cleaned up the marijuana imprisonment is no longer a problem in California. So we're glad of that.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting, the history of this. I was going to ask you more about the legacy of Prop 64, but you've actually addressed that to some degree in your remarks. So I'm going to ask you instead, in your mind, what further should be done in this area? If you were king, what might you do particularly?
Well, I think first of all, I think the simplest thing that should be done at the federal level, very simple, is simply allow researchers to do research with marijuana that is legal under state law. We have all these states now where marijuana is legal, and anybody over 21, or actually over 18 if you have a doctor's recommendation in California. Anyone over 21 can go into the store and buy all sorts of cannabis products, many of them very novel. I mean, all sorts of new delivery forms have been developed. We have these vaporizers, we have edibles, we have drinks that have been developed, and all of them are sort of unique to the legal market, but cannot be used in research by researchers who have federal connections like yourself. So this is really stupid that, researchers can't go out and test products that consumers are legally using in the states. Very simple change to federal laws would fix that, but it hasn't been fixed. And that is really aggravating. The other thing is, I think in California and a lot of legal states, the whole medical theme has been lost in the broader adult use legalization effort. When we had just medical marijuana in California, the dispensaries that sold it at least had to have the personnel there, the bud tenders had to understand some of the medical effects. It had to uh, be knowledgeable from that end. That has disappeared. You have a lot of bud tenders now who really know nothing about medical marijuana or have a lot of false ideas about it. For instance, there's the persistent myth that, indica marijuana that is marketed as indica varieties is different than marijuana that has sativa, and that indicas have one set of effects which are sedative and sativas have another set of effects which are more energizing. And that's total hokum, as we have demonstrated in some studies of our own where we've analyzed indicas and sativas, so-called, and there is no chemical difference that you can corresponds to indicas or sativas. This is all mythology and hoo-ha. There are things you can do. You can look at the terpene contents. You can look at minor cannabinoids and try to make inferences about, their value, but that information has really sort of gotten lost. It would be really helpful to have a better, a pharmaceutically aimed regulatory regime, actually, where we had products that were reviewed and approved for pharmaceutical use according to their specific formulations. So, their delivery mode, and their potency and their terpene and cannabinoid contents. But that is not happening at the moment. Theoretically, when they established Prop 64 in California, state did establish medical and adult use licenses But in fact, there's really no difference between the products that are approved medically and the products that are approved for adult use. And we would like to see, I think, a sharpening of that. And we would also, I think, like to see a better prescription kind of system. Because at present, the situation with medical marijuana patients in California is, theoretically, to be a medical marijuana patient, all you need a doctor's written recommendation. But the only actual formal state identification that you can get for that is there's a state ID card program that is very inaccessible and hardly used by anybody. It involves going down to your the County Department of Public Health, which may be like only one office in the entire county of Alameda County. And then, in an office that's open on alternate Tuesdays from 2 to 5 p.m., you can apply for your medical card. You have to pay a bunch of money for it. And so the medical ID card program in California is basically a joke, and hardly anyone uses it. I think there's a total of under 2,000 people in the medical ID card system. That we know that there are probably on the order of 1 million Californians who do use marijuana for medical purposes, but there's no way of really identifying who they are and giving them medicine that is specifically, for medical use. So I think we need to do a lot of work in that area.
Yeah, and there's, as you say, no particular value other than, I guess, you wouldn't have to pay sales tax or something.
All right. You don't have to pay sales tax, but there's
Or
plenty
the
of other
excise
taxes.
tax, I forget which, but
It's a sales tax.
yeah. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done, but one of the main things, as you point out, is creating some sort of harmonization between state and federal law. You also mentioned the point very validly that lots of people are using all these products, but it's impossible to do research on them because, again, investigators such as myself cannot bring, say, onto the campus of the University of California something that was bought in a dispensary and even analyze it, never mind administer it to somebody. So these are real public health problems here that we don't understand what these products do, how they're handled by the body, and so forth. Yeah, it's a problem. Well, Dale Geringer, thank you so much for joining our podcast. I really appreciate it, and keep continuing your good work in educating both the public and also our legislators and elected officials, policymakers on these important topics.
Thank you very much for having me on, and hopefully we will make some progress.
Very good. Goodbye, Dale.
If you like this podcast, please subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. For more information on the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research at UC San Diego, please find us on social media at CMCR_UCSD on Twitter or X, Instagram, and other social media platforms. Or visit our website at cmcr.ucsd.edu. Thanks for listening.